Everyone for tuning in to yet another episode in which I stream about issues related to public transport. Now, I am currently in what is sort of my office at the Marin Institute in downtown Brooklyn, um, and not at the usual time, and the reason is. And the reason has to do with when people could make it. So this is intended to be a Q&A regarding our construction costs project. It's called the Transit Costs Project. You can also call it Transit Costs Project slash Infrastructure Project slash Infrastructure Project if you like silly acronyms. In this case, it would be TCP/IP. I will show you. Hopefully, it captured it. I sometimes tweet the pics. Uh, we sometimes I get whimsical with board doodling. So as I said, we're gonna do a Q&A, and we have the cheap cases out. They've been out for months. The New York case is done, but is currently under a media embargo. This is also, unfortunately, also the synthesis, but I will take questions. So, okay, Borners, I will get to you in one sec. I'm going to try to answer the questions in chronological order. This is a pre-question, and I've got to spend a lot of time on this one, which is one suggestion that often comes up to solve is to hire outsiders to run the process. Um, and this is by itself a good suggestion. And then comes the interesting question. Has this been done successfully? Successfully is a really important rejoinder. And the reason is that uh, and the reason is that uh, the kind of default way of saying, "Oh, we the government are incompetent," but and we understand that we've read public choice theory, or we pretend to have read public choice theory, and we're going to try to privatize things. And bringing in foreigners, even if it's a foreign state-owned company, is not too different from privatization. To be honest, the sort of mechanisms that make state-owned companies genuinely different from private monopolies rarely to never work outside their own borders. Uh, the exceptions are, I think, in cases that are literally adjacent. And even then, not always. Things like France, Belgium, or Germany, Austria. And and the issue is that a company like SNCF, public monopoly essentially on intercity rail and for the most part also regional rail in France, answers to the French state. If service is bad, even if profits are high, the French state, hi Terence Bernanke, if even if profits are good, if service is bad, this state will complain. So essentially, there's no shareholder. I don't want to call it capitalism because it's not capitalism. There's no shareholder state capitalism there because the state has other concerns than the profitability of SNCF. The state does want SNCF to be profitable, and they don't want it to lose money, but they're not maximizing profit at the expense of everything else, like good service. And this means that the sort of shenanigans that they're handling with Eurostar and Thales, the extremely high fares, for example, they're not as acceptable domestically. But internationally, even again in Belgium and in Britain, suddenly this kind of profit maximization switch comes into them, and then they act as a monopoly. And this is true when you just try to privatize the state with them. This is something that they do in Quebec a lot. Quebec has the kind of Anglosphere bug of privatizing the state. The only difference is instead of privatizing it to English-speaking consultancies, it privatizes the state to French-speaking ones. But the results are the same. Now, this does not mean that Andrew Grizzle's question is fruitless. It does not mean that you should not hire these people. You absolutely should, but you should not just privatize planning them. You should try to learn from them. You should try to do secondments. You should try to do exchange programs. You should not do turnkeys. You should not do a turnkey process where you just invite Japan to run the entire process for you. A bunch of developing countries do that, and the results are always bad, essentially because Japan tries to optimize for the Japanese situation, the Japanese situation of property rights, the Japanese situation of wages, capital costs, reliability of electric grid, government cleanliness. You do this in a place like India, and all of these assumptions are wrong, and then people who are much more familiar with the Indian situation, when they do things internally, they do things much better. And as a result, in India, their construction costs are very high, but actually the exceptions are not where they bring in outsiders. The exceptions are where they don't. The exceptions are things like the electrification project of Indian Railways, which is very fast and very cheap and entirely internal. The stuff that they bring Japan to do for them, that's where the expenses are, or the part where they're internally trying to imitate Japan. Same thing. So you should learn from Spain. You should learn from Japan, Korea, France, Italy, Turkey, Sweden, Germany in some cases. Learn from them. But and you can even hire. Oh, and you can even hire people in house. You can hire in the same way that Andy Byford was not a private person involved in the privatization of the MTA of New York State to British consultancies. No, he was a British civil servant who had been hired in Canada and then in the United States as a civil servant. That is also something you should be doing. Okay, and now I'm gonna take the other questions. Borners, have we been trying to media blitz? Yes. We are talking to journalists. We're telling them what's in the report. We're asking them what they're most interested in hearing, and then we're going to talk to them about these specific issues. So far, it's been mostly American journalists. I do not know what the UK media situation is going to be. I have not heard from British media very much. I hope so. I hope that we do hear more. I hope that Britain. There are certain things in Britain that suggest to me that Britain is ready to move on. To move on from the failure of what in the Sweden report, in the Sweden case here, I call the globalized system, so privatizing the state to consultancies, to design build where you don't even have enough in-house expertise to oversee the contractors, to privatizing risk. Britain seems in some ways as the country that has done this for the longest, the country that is readiest and most willing to move on. And the example is the issue of rail nationalization. So while the EU is keeping with this breaking of operations and capital as two separate things, uh, in the UK already there's a countervailing trend. The UK has been doing this for a generation, and it's not considered a success. As far as I can tell, the main reason the system has persisted is that the British public, in my opinion, correctly perceived Jeremy Corbyn as too incompetent to handle rail renationalization. However, I can read polls. The optimistic polls are having the Tories be the official opposition by a large margin. The pessimistic ones for the Tories have them not even being the official opposition. It's something that is Labour going to do it? Who knows? But it's something that Britain is, I think, willing to at least some extent move on from. So I'm optimistic that in the event we get more British contacts, it'll be easier to explain what's wrong. Unfortunately, Britain is bad at learning from places that don't speak English is a big problem. Okay, and I'm gonna take more questions. Borners, if you have follow-up questions, just type them and I'm gonna get to you. Hi you. Uh, you see cut and cover and boring compared, but it's hard to tell which is better without the specifics. Are there cases where cut and cover tunneling might cost more than boring? Yes! Yes! Excellent question. Yes. Thank you for asking the question. The answer is absolutely yes. And I'm going to take your second question, which is actually completely separate because civil engineers never get to ask themselves these questions in the US. They're told in advance, you shall not cut and cover. So where is cut and cover worse than boring? The answer is when the surface is too difficult. When might the surface be too difficult? Well, let's start with when you go underwater, right? You can't do cut and cover. But also, let's look at the second subway tunnel built in the world, and I might be missing very short ones. Please, if you want to nitpick, I highly recommend it in comments on Twitch or YouTube, but it's not going to change the truth value of what I'm going to say. So the first subway in the world is the London Underground's Metropolitan line. It is roughly this line. This is built cut and cover, and you may be able to see on at this zoom level on Google Earth that most of it was cut and cover underneath one of London's very few wide arteries. It's called Euston. It has a bunch of names, but here it's Euston Road. Um, and then, based on its success, they decided to build a second one, also cut and cover, this being the 1860s. There's no deep boring yet. The tunneling shield does exist, it has been invented already, but you cannot put a steam train in it, and rail electrification in the 1860s has not yet been invented. What is the second line? It is called the District Line. Uh, and in fact, it was designed to connect with the Met Line in a circle. This was for generations called the Circle Line until they kind of broke up in the circle. This is the district. Now, parts of the district are under a street. Here, the district is under the embankment. Instead, it was built alongside the embankment. The Thames was embanked very late in the process. So, for example, in Paris, the Seine had been embanked for much longer than the Thames. So when this was built, when the embankment, they also at the same time built the district line beneath. But parts of the district line were not built under the embankment, but under here. You might notice just on this kind of Google Earth tourism, not even Google Street View tourism, that there's no street network here. I mean, there is, but you're not seeing the district line go like this. You're not seeing the district line go under the Piccadilly. The district line kind of carves its own right of way. This meant that they had to demolish buildings here, and yeah, they could rebuild some of them and sell them for real estate development, for residential property development. But at the end of the day, they were doing mass demolitions in South Kensington. This area today is fabulously wealthy and expensive. In the 1860s, it was less expensive than today because it was the 1860s, but by the standards of the 1860s, the area was fabulously wealthy and expensive. And because of that, the construction costs of the district line were very high. I want to say that in today's money, it's going to be more than $100 million a kilometer, which I think maybe 110 or 120. By today's standards, it's very cheap. By the standards of the 1860s or even the 1930s, it was very expensive. This is why they stopped building cut and cover after the district line. There were some other proposals in London to do that. For example, there was a proposal that had the support, and it got the approval of Parliament, and it had the support of the two connecting railways to connect Euston and Charing Cross along the alignment that is currently the Charing Cross reverse branch of the Northern Line, but they couldn't find money. And for a generation, there were outward expansions of the underground, but no new trunk lines, and it would take until the invention of electric railways and the tunneling shield for urban subways, and what is now the Northern Line, for London to resume building its underground. So if you need to do mass property demolition, if you have a very complex underground, maybe you're not building line number 1, maybe you're building line number 8, yeah, you are going to resort to a tunneling machine. You're not going to do cut and cover. But as I said, this is not something that civil engineers are going to get to decide in North America. The only analysis I've seen recently was a French one. I'm forgetting from when. I think it was from the 2010s that said that cut and cover was substantially cheaper. I can also point out some examples in our database of some outward phasing extensions done with cut and cover that were substantially cheaper. I've not seen North American engineers tell me that, just because North American engineers, to a large extent, have not been in a position to say we need to do that. Would hiring foreigners work for redesigning the institution? No. You need people who know both what's wrong and what's right. So hiring foreigners is useful, but in the sense that you will hire, let's say, Andy Byford, and Andy Byford is used to certain high standards of service from London and Toronto, and yes, I did in fact overpronounce the largest city of Canada in the same way I might pronounce the capital of Russia as Moskva. So in London and Toronto, they are used to very high off-peak frequency, and if you say, well, we need to do some kind of midday or weekend frequency cuts for maintenance, you say, no, midday frequency is important, figure out how to do it overnight. Even if you don't have overnight shutdowns, some of the and I don't think anything in London is 24/7, but London is starting to do some 24/3, so running overnight during weekends, as in Berlin. So, oh my God, why are you doing this? This is so terrible. This is useful, but sometimes just no. But sometimes you need to know both what is bad and what is good. Um, so hiring foreigners would work to some extent. You need to know what you're looking for. Thanks, Frank. You're talking about high water table. Yeah. In some cases, and I don't mean high water table. I mean way worse cases than this. I mean in Amsterdam, it's cut and cover will just be a canal. And this is a real problem, and this is one of the reasons Amsterdam construction costs are so high. Another is that Dutch institutions are very, in the language of our Sweden case, globalized. Essentially, they've anglicized. Um, and they've even anglicized things that Britain does not do. The Netherlands privatizes healthcare system. I mean, not in the American model in any way, shape, or form, but they privatize their universal healthcare system. Whereas in Britain, the one thing they will not privatize is the NHS. Um, Consultants are essentially job opportunities. Yes and no. Certainly, it's nothing. It's not moralized this way in the same way that jobs, in the sense that blue collar manufacturing jobs are moralized as inherently better. Um, I also don't think that it's done through lobbying. I don't think it's done through some kind of quid pro quo where Arab tells the state of New York, you don't need to figure this out yourselves. Don't worry your pretty little head about this. Just let us handle this. I don't think it's like that. In fact, the consultants they speak to, and the consultants that Eric speaks to, are adamant that it's more pleasant to work with an informed client. It's not exactly the it's not exactly the private consultants exploiting the state. It's the state setting itself on fire, if that makes sense. Prague. Oh, yes. India needs to explore how it electrifies so cheap. I don't know how they do it. I don't know if it's just normal or slightly worse than normal labor efficiency, but Indian wages. And so very low costs, whereas they have so much lower efficiency that it countermands the lower wages for stuff like subway construction. In design, yeah, there's in design build there's a CCM, there is design builder, sure, but what you need is an informed client at the end of the day. And if you try to privatize this, you're just gonna end up paying more because for example a CCM might not know what is important and what is not important. Um, they they have an incentive to bid low. They have an incentive to stay on budget. They don't have an incentive to be cheap, if that makes sense. So they will get hired based on a bid, and if they bid too much, someone else may take it. But if it's too risky, they'll raise compensate. Um, and at the end of the day, they don't get. And at the end of the day, if there's a cost blowout, as long as they can say it's someone else's fault, they're in the clear. It's not like the government where they can say it's someone else's fault, but nobody will believe them. And this is a big problem. There's a problem with over design in this case, and it's the same. It's sorry, not the thing. It's different from overbuilding. Overbuilding is when you build a station too big. Over design is when you assume things will be necessary that may or may not be necessary, but you don't want to take the risk. Network Rail published a report on construction costs. Please send me that report. Now I'm trying to think how you can send me the report because I'm not going to check email on a recorded stream. Post it on Twitter. It's probably easiest. Just one more lane, bro. Yeah, I mean, I guess eventually they'll just decide to go to general elections sometime in the next 2 years. Yeah, exactly. Couldn't cover Goddard based tunnel now, exactly. I mean, by the way, in New York and in Paris, I'm not sure about Berlin, but in New York and Paris in the 1900s, they did not 100% couldn't cover because underwater stuff was done through. I think it was done through tunneling shield in New York, and I think in Paris, Line 4 was immersed too, but not tunneling shield, but I'm not sure. But also, New York built the Washington Heights stations, the deep ones, 168th, 181st, 191st. It debored them. I don't think it was with a tunneling machine. I don't know to what extent it was with a proper tunneling shield because it was underground, not underwater. So it was just much easier to just tunnel across what is essentially a little mountain. Um, but these were not cut and cover. It was mostly not entirely cut and cover. Ooh, huh. Yeah, London built. Yeah, so if you do a bunch of things at the same time, it's helpful. If you have agencies that talk to each other, even if you don't do it at the same time, you can gain the same knowledge. In Milan, Eric is a giant fan of the Milan. Uh, I don't want to call it maybe org chart, in which the tunnel builder, Metropolitano di Milano, is not the same as the metro operator. um, but is the same as essentially it started out as a metro tunnel builder. It did a very good job. As a result, they gave it the task of building more underground infrastructure. For example, I believe all of the water and sewer lines in Milan are also done by Metropolitana di Milano by MM. Uh, Eric is a giant fan of that reorg. Um, I think it is good. I am slightly wary of it, and the reason I'm slightly wary is that I'm slightly wary that politicians will just announce a brand new organizational chart where nothing will change. After all, the MTA in New York has urban transit in the shape of New York City Transit, and the MTA bus company under its umbrella alongside commuter rail, the LIRR and Metro North, and yet they do not coordinate at all. Yeah, okay, so trans 17 run. I'm not saying contractors get a free run. Things they absolutely don't. Contractors. The problem with contractors is, or rather, not, or rather, there's no problem with contractors. The problem with consultants is not that they exist, is that the state uses them, and it's also through a design build. Is when the state uses consultants in design build in lieu of in-house supervision expertise. So Sweden is a very good example of what to do. Now, Sweden is also a good example of certain things that you should not do. But Sweden, um, while adopting the globalized system, has massively lower costs than Britain or the Netherlands. Um, Now, to some extent, they have not fully adopted that system, but I'm seeing the current costs of the ongoing, much more globalized system, not the Stockholm metro, which is less so, but the Gothenburg commuter rail through running tunnel. It's called the Westlink or Vestlänken. And one of the things that they're doing is while they're aiming to privatize more and more things and become a pure client, they do want to retain in-house expertise. Why do they want to retain in-house expertise? Because they don't want to just destroy the state. And also, again, the consultants that we've spoken to prefer an informed state. They do not prefer a state that has exploit me tattooed on its forehead, because it's not a clean transfer of money from private to public. It is hectic. It is being micromanaged. And yes, you get more money at the end, perhaps, in profit, but it was so risky, and the project takes too long, and you had to do surge hires to get more of your own engineers just for all of the extra costs that have been imposed on you. It's a headache. Why do it? Um, so what they do in Sweden is they've specifically, so they're privatizing track maintenance on the railways, but they're keeping three segments in-house as a benchmark. Um, so again, I do not think contractors get a free run. not in the slightest. I actually have a blog post about this. It's not my most recent, which is a crayon, but it is the one before it. It is called How Sandbagged Costs Become Real. So sandbagging, it's so apparently uh, it was considered a an improvised weapon, kind of like a shiv. So it was considered some kind of hoodlum thing to do to fight with a sandbag, and it became a poker term of pretending you're weaker than you are, kind of a cheating way. Um, and so to sandbag means to make something look weaker than it is. It's not to kind of lade it with extra weight. But this can also be done by lading it with extra weight, making something look weaker. And the issue is a lot of these. So if you're missing benefits, the benefits will happen, right? If you're saying that your subway expansion will get 50,000 riders a day because you've only counted rush hour commuters, and then you run good service, you will also get the others, and you will overperform. Um, well, not if you don't run off-peak service, of course. But if you say that it will cost um, $1 billion when you can do it in 500 million because you added a bunch of extras, the extras will happen. Is the main gist. And contractors, so consultants are kind of like one mechanism in which this half a billion becomes a billion, not through any malfeasance by the consultants themselves. They just risk compensate. They're being micromanaged. Um, Essentially, the costs are just higher. It's not that profits are higher; they are also higher for risk compensation, but the actual costs of dealing with the consultants are higher. Um, Indian electrification is so cheap because it's 25 kV. I'm benchmarking it to European costs, which are also high voltage. In fact, among the European examples that I know, I think the cheapest electrification is in Italy, where it's DC. It's not about how many substations you do; it's how good you are at building infrastructure. Is Boston a perfect example of an uninformed client doing design build? Um, it's one of them. Uh, so I don't remember having heard that in terms of in connection with GLX. Um, I've heard that in connection with other things, not in Boston, like Caltrain. I haven't heard that, but I'm seeing that in connection with the regional rail project, which is being unfortunately mismanaged, which is really bad because the political commitment has not even been made. Um, oh, no, sandbagging is not an Indiana Jones reference. Sandbagging. I'm just reading off what I heard on Etim online while I was researching the post I just showed you. Um, is there a correlation between housing construction costs and transit construction costs? I don't know. I don't know. Uh, so I know what the housing construction cost is in China because they're extremely good at reporting how much housing is being built, what size, and what the cost is. Um, Elsewhere, I need to rely on industry sources and hope that they are comprehensive. Um, as far as I can tell, European construction costs, which I mean French and German ones, are about the same as Chinese ones in PPP, so purchasing power parity terms, maybe slightly higher. Italian ones, as far as I remember from what Marco told me, I think last year, are slightly lower. Um, this is actually reasonably true of the construction cost situation. Um, Unfortunately, I can't tell you what the Dutch construction costs are. Um, I think I read something about them, but I don't remember. I don't remember. I will say I don't remember Dutch construction costs being unusually high for housing. I don't remember Spanish ones being unusually low for housing. American ones are unusually high if you're doing urban condos. There's some extra requirements involved, and it's hard to do exact comparisons. For example, so about housing construction costs. There is an American premium, which other people than me are much more fluent in. Stephen Smith of Market Urbanism is the best person to talk to if you're in America, in the American advocacy or urbanist sphere. What I'm understanding from a bunch of people who tweet a lot about this, developers, architects, is that in the United States, uh, there's a hard cap on how tall a mid-rise building can be, and that's 6 floors, sometimes possibly 7. And the reason is that construction outside New York and South Florida is done with light wood frame. Maximum number of floors is 5. You can do, it's something called 5/1. First floor is concrete. The next 5 are wood. Very rarely 2 are concrete, 5 are wood. This has a lot of different implications. So on the one hand, it should reduce construction costs, but then you have extra regulations about things like sprinklers, or you need 2 means of egress. So you need 2 fire code separated staircases, whereas mid-rise buildings in Europe are single staircase. So more staircases, more building area that is not rentable, right? You're not renting the staircases, right? You're renting the apartments. The height cap means that to maximize floor area, you build the buildings thick rather than taller. So in Europe, these buildings might be in the costliest metro areas. They start from 7 floors and they go up to about 9, sometimes even a bit more. 7, 8, 9, something like that. And then they're thinner. Maybe the usual is about 15 meters. The typical European ratio of the area of a building of the floor area of a building to the window frontage is about 7 to 8 meters. In America, on the newer condos, it is 10. And essentially, the deeper building, the deep, so apartments are essentially deeper, and you can't add more bedrooms to a deeper apartment. So Americans generally live in much larger apartments or houses than do Europeans. I think New York City on average is about even with the nicer parts of Europe, like Germany. On median, I imagine Germany is much better because New York is much higher inequality. But the US is better than every European country by a significant margin. Now, if you live in a house, then you just have more and more and more rooms, right? You can have an office, maybe 2 working parents. Each of them has a separate office and a guest room and a den, and so just more and more rooms because a single family house. Remember, I mentioned these ratios: 9 meters, 7 meters, 10 meters. If you have a single family house, let's say single story, and you're building it massive, 15 meters by 15 meters, that is 225 square meters, which is pretty typical recent American house. So 225 square meters divided by 15 times 4 by 60. So the ratio we're talking about is less than 4, so much more window frontage. So you could just have more rooms because bedrooms need windows, and the living room needs a window. So if you're trying to do the same, if you're trying to pull off this kind of construction standards in a condo where your ratio of window frontage to area is not 4 meters but 12 or even 10, you need to essentially include rooms that do not need windows, and this is where you're getting walk-in closets, and this is also where you're getting a bathroom in every bedroom. Something that growing up in Israel, was not even considered a luxury. It was just not done. Like I grew up thinking of it as something that is both an extreme luxury and even within the set of extreme luxury, unusual. I didn't have it growing up, and I grew up well off. And so the thing is, the bathrooms are more expensive than other rooms. So American housing construction costs are higher, but some of them but it's much more complicated than the transit issue. For example, it's not the same procurement issue. I wouldn't call it an overbuild. Oh, I'm going to. Oh, and Prague, you're saying they're heavily related to NFPA staircase requirement. Remember that a lot of other places in the world have the same NFPA. Turkey uses NFPA. I think Spain does as well. The issue is that when you don't build out of light wood, so when you do concrete or steel or even mass timber, you don't need 2 staircases. Okay. Trans 1729. I like your name, by the way. Both the name and the number. Um, so do I think the state can afford the quantity of in-house engineers? Yes. Yes, absolutely. Oh, and you're telling me that engineers get paid more in the private industry than in state agencies? Yeah, pay better. Pay better, get better HR. Um, so maybe a good alternative to privatization of the state is private sectorization of the state, by which I mean instead of doing, instead of closing down your in-house agencies, which New York did. New York had, I want to say 1.6 thousand people working, not all engineers, but engineers, staff, maybe cleaners, whatever, working for capital construction in the 2000s, and they've essentially privatized that. Not everyone, but they've privatized a lot of that in-house expertise. In-house expertise, to be very clear, was not good. Remember, there's no MAGA here. In Sweden, I might be able to make a slightly MAGA-ish argument that Sweden was a proper country or whatever before, up until about 2010, or in Canada up until 2000 or 2005. In the United States, remember, um, outside New York, you can see evidence of construction cost blowouts in the 70s. In New York, in the 1930s. Um, so can they afford the quantity? Yes. Um, Even something like 1.6 thousand engineers, again, sorry, 1.6 thousand staff, uh, who include engineers but also not engineers, in a city the size of New York, or in a metro area the size of New York, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's money, but it's money that, I mean, think about it, 1.6 thousand. I don't know what they get paid. I do know what the average person in New York City Transit gets paid. And it's about, I want to say 160 with benefits. Including higher paid people like the managers, the senior engineers, the senior planners. People get paid in the middle, like the train drivers and the bus drivers get paid pretty well. It's a really hard job. And then the lower paid people, the assistants, junior planners get paid poorly, the cleaners. Um, so if you're assuming it's the same, 1.6 by 160 is $250 million a year. And yeah, that's money, but the budget for New York City Transit, the operations, is I want to say about eight billion. So it's a cost that's second order, and saves you so much money. And again, you want to be private, and you want to do this kind of private sectorization where you have this state-owned things like Metropolitana di Milano, which does need to pay very high wages because Italian wages are kind of bad. But in New York, yeah, you need to pay competitive wages for the private sector. You might even want to pay above private sector norms. That's what Spain does. In Spain, in general, in Hispanic and Lusitanian culture, uh, there's extreme prestige attached to the engineer, especially the public sector engineer. In Spain, the public sector pays better than the private sector. So essentially, the elite in the United States are, first of all, it's an elite of legacies and people whose parents could afford to pay for the right resume building, and then they become generic whatever after they graduate Harvard, Yale, Princeton, whatever, and same is true in Britain with Oxbridge. Okay, in Oxbridge you don't have legacy preferences, but otherwise it's kind of generalist elite. Um, the continent, I want to say the continental, but I believe China's like this, Japan's like this, Latin America's like this, Israel's like this. There's just much more prestige on being a scientist or engineer. Um, And in the case of New York, so yeah, you would hire people and pay them very well. You want to make sure that the best engineering students at whatever schools you're hiring from will want to work for you. You need to also so in addition to salaries, you need to give them a good promotion, which is not promotion opportunities, which is not bad, which is not hard, but also listen to them, listen to their advice. If you're in a situation which is very easy in an organization that starts out sclerotic, let's call it Deutsche Bahn, has the same problem, that the 50-year-old manager knows less than a 25-year-old fresh hire, listen to the 25-year-old fresh hire. They know more than you. Um, so you need to treat the engineers well. You need to give them more authority. You need to pay them well, and you need to have good HR, which means you don't need to. I mean, you don't need to have bullshit regulations that make hiring take months or even years. Okay. Oh, change gears. Oh, two kitchens. Yes. Two kitchens, or the kind of Don Draper lifestyle, where essentially the apartment has duplicate sets of spaces, one for entertaining guests, one for the use of the family, like two dining homes. Um, I don't think the dining hall is expensive, but the kitchen is, and certainly the bathrooms are. So you'd expect that larger units should cost less per square meter because there's only one kitchen. You should expect some kind of digressivity, but at least in the American case, the extra bathrooms and bad regulations and a kind of broken construction labor market make things more expensive. Do I know why competent agencies don't use NATM than TBMs? I don't know. My understanding is that NATM is not available in all cases. My understanding is that NATM is a top-down construction method that you can't really use in a place like underwater. Um, so my understanding is that you would use NATM for short things where a TBM would be overkill because TBMs have higher fixed costs, as I understand it. Um, and my understanding is also that NATM requires very skilled workforce. Um, and you would expect that the New York workforce, well, very well paid and very experienced, is very skilled. Apparently, it's not. Apparently they can't do NATM in New York. NY's metropolitan GDP, yeah. Yeah, New York is filthy rich. Like I don't think New Yorkers get that they live in a filthy rich area because they focus on maybe on the filthy part and not on the filthy rich part. But New York, I mean, I don't just mean that the private sector wages in New York are extremely high. I mean things like, I mean uh, the resources available to New York just end up getting wasted and not getting okay. I don't want to see arguments with David Shore. I want okay. Um, Borner, by the way, did you send me the thing? Because again, I'm not going to look at emails or at private messages on screen because okay. All right. Oh yeah, I'm seeing this Center for City. Okay. Borners, I'm looking at this on my phone and okay. I'm looking at this on my phone and it's not a URL that I can just type. So can you either type it here or oh, is the final report out? I mean, the link to the blog post leads to it, or rather led to it for 12 hours. Something there is under an embargo. Um, and I'm not the person who wrote the contract on this, so I am not the best person to ask about the exact language. I will say that as far as I can tell, by which I mean my understanding of what Eric told me, is that we can publish in, I want to say, 3 weeks. So I believe last week of November, just before American Thanksgiving, we will be able to publish everything. Um, Again, we will see. Essentially, it's to give the MTA. Essentially, the MTA gave us access to certain information in exchange for us giving them enough time to comment. And they claimed that the final report was also subject to that agreement, even though it did not use uh, the what's it called, the special things that they gave us. Um, we used them for the detail level of the New York report, but apparently the way that the agreement is written, that is still under an embargo. Again, I believe we have 3 more weeks. Um, so yeah, it's going to be discussed at not a very productive time, especially between American Thanksgiving and New Year's. American office productivity is kind of junk. I don't think it was deliberate. Like we sent it at a specific time, and the embargo was triggered by that. Um, okay. I'm caught up. So if people have more questions, go ahead and shoot. Yeah, it's. I hope it's worth it. Um, it. I mean, I will say that it will tell you details that I haven't talked about before. Um, I don't think there's a specific. I don't think there's a very general line there that I haven't said. Like it's not like we're not. I'm not a New York Times political reporter. Okay, I don't do the thing where I hold off bombshells to publish them in my book a year after they're no longer relevant. Okay, I'm not. I mean, I'm not Maggie Haberman. I mean, I like the New York Times investigative reporters. I like their Metro desk. They're doing a very good job. They're political reporters. Yeah. Um, Again, Borners, I can look at your report, but I'm not gonna do it on stream because I don't want the like my entire Twitter messages. Um, um, Also, the other Borners, the other thing you told me, would I want to do interviews with people on the internet? Oh yeah, sure, I should. Um, I can reach out to I can reach out to the vloggers. Journalists in New York need competitive wages. Do you know how much New York Times? Do you know how much New York Times reporters get paid? Like the ones who don't get high wages are working for Vice, The Observer, maybe the Daily News, um, other newspapers, also things that resemble newspapers like the New York Post. The ones working for the New York Times, I mean, they earn very well. Thank you very much. Like or the Atlantic. I mean, again, I mean, I've spoken about this with recent hires of theirs, just as a just out of curiosity, and I mean, and they're not going to tell me their exact wage, but they earn well. They don't need the book income. They also are not getting the book income. I mean, if you're buying Maggie Haberman's book, is because you're a fan of Maggie Haberman. It's not because of the scoop, which is going to get leaked anyway. Um, do we see variation within the US based on set utility laws? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Um, the reason I suspect it's not going to matter very much is that utility relocation costs are small. So, Second Avenue Subway is a tunnel which is about a quarter of the cost, three and a half stations, um, which are together about three quarters of the cost. I'm forgetting how much a half station cost, much less because it was a refurbishment. The cavern had already been built. The other three cost about the same each. Um, and only one of them, 96, had significant um, cut and cover requiring so much utility relocation, um, and because that does fall under the embargo, I'm not going to tell you how much of that was utility relocation, but I will say it was decidedly secondary. The utility relocation evokes a lot of fear. Remember how I complained before that that contractors, even when they make more money on a poorly run project than on a well-run project, they don't enjoy what makes them what pays better. They're not hedge funds. Hedge funds specifically by specifically invest in risky assets and figure out how to bundle them in a way that makes them less risky because the hedge fund has money, and when you have enough money and you're sufficiently um, diverse and sufficiently well hedged, you can reduce risk. This is not the contractors or the consultants. Um, a risky project they hate. They would rather not. They would rather work with people who pay lower but more reliable profits and don't smear a 5 year project onto 10 years. Um, I bring this up because conflict with utilities is a nightmare. But it's an administrative nightmare. The cost is significant for small projects. For example, it is a large cost raiser for installing elevators for accessibility, but not for something very big like digging an entirely new train station. The fear of it, however, does lead to a lot of defensive design. For example, deep mining, what you do not need to deep mine. Um, so maybe if Illinois, so maybe if the Illinois rule leads to less fear of dealing with utilities, and it does reduce costs, but so long as the construction methods are the same defensive ones that try to avoid utilities entirely, it should not make a very large difference. It should make a secondary difference. Um, so as I said, as I said, I don't know. I wish I knew the Chicago construction costs, by which I mean I wish Chicago built more rapid transit. Sadly, it doesn't really do so. I wish a Gray Line project happened. I wish maybe Red Line extensions. Um, yeah, electrification of metro. I mean, there are a bunch of good things that Chicago should be doing. I just, unfortunately, I'm not seeing them, and without seeing actual costs, I can't do very good comparisons. I can do comparisons with proposed costs, but proposed costs have a problem. If it's early in the proposal, the costs are likely to be lowballed. Costs tend to run over, not under. Conversely, if it's a project that has been designed and canceled, then then maybe it's too cheap because it would have run overboard, but maybe it's also more expensive because why are projects canceled? Well, one of the things that might lead to the cancellation of an infrastructure or any other project is excessive cost. So I try to, for example, purge things that have been canceled from our database. Um, so long story short, I don't think that we will see variation. The answer is I don't know, but I expect the answer to be negative. I think we have about 10-ish more minutes, and then I need to skedaddle. Um, hmm. Okay, if there are no questions, we're just going to mine what Bordner told me from our side. Oh, you mentioned John Elledge. Yeah, I know him. I should talk to John Elledge because I know him from City Metric. I used to write things for him. Um, for example, this one. Um, like I was talking about different kinds of regional rail, where in London terms, this would be Crossrail and this would be Thameslink. With recent Metra, Metra is extremely trying. Metra is very much what worked for my grandfather works for me. Did it work for my grandfather? I assume so. I'm not gonna look. It's even somehow more trad than the East Coast railways, and the LRR and Metro North are trad in their own ways, but maybe they're trad 60s, 70s, so they're trad, but EMUs for the most part, high platforms. And Metra has these gallery cars that they tried to procure. I mean, probably maybe there's something else with the locomotives, but they were trying to also procure, and I imagine you know this, that they were trying to procure something called gallery cars for the benefits of people who do not know what they are. Let me see if I can find that. Okay, so this is bi-level rail car is not okay. So a passenger coach, whether powered, that is to say a multiple unit, or unpowered, can have one or two levels. Can be single level, single level or bi-level. I generally think that they should do more single levels and fewer bi-levels, based on the example of Tokyo, and I have criticized Paris for over relying on bi-levels. But within the bi-level world, you can do normie bi-level. This is a normie bi-level. It's American, yeah, but it's normally bi-level. Bi-levels you can sometimes you board from the lower level, sometimes you board from a middle level like this. These are both called bi-levels. Um, uh, a bi-level in, let's say, Germany is quite likely to be this. For example, the bi-levels used for the airport trains in Berlin. And then you have two full levels you walk through. Now, a gallery car Let me see if they have the interior. Okay, yeah, interior. The gallery car has a. You see that the gallery looks a little bit like a shopping mall in that or here so what I mean by shopping mall is that you know how when you go to a shopping mall, the lowest level of the shopping mall, typically the basement, is the only one with a continuous floor, and then the other floors above it have a floor that's wide enough to be used as a sidewalk, but there's a hole in the middle so you can gaze down. So if you're on, let's say, the third level of the mall, and you can see across and see what stores are on the first floor. Um, And so, this is a gallery car. It's like this, open. So the idea is that you sit in these. I think it's one seat on each side as opposed to two if it were full level. And then the idea is that a conductor walks only on the lower level, and then the conductor can uh, collect tickets from both levels. There is a problem with that, which is that in advanced developed countries, they don't have conductors collecting tickets. They either have fare gates or they have a proof of payment system. Um, they're multi-level and bi-levels. So in Canadian and American usage, they call bi-levels if they're low boarding, multi-levels if they have this intermediate level. Okay, so bear in mind that where I live, first of all, every car has an intermediate level, even if you board from the lower level. The superliner situation where you board from the lower level and you move between cars on the on the upper level, I think that the loading gauge are the loading gauge is not sufficient for that. Let me find for example, so the Stadler Kiss. Um, you note that the Stadler Kiss, you board on the lower level, but you note that there's a middle level for moving between cars. Um, and whether you board here or here, that's not considered a big difference in European terminology. So maybe they're bi-levels or a little bit double deckers, if that makes sense. Just because double deckers that's a Britishism. So gallery cars are for ticket collection. Nobody does that anymore. Because nobody does that anymore, nobody makes that anymore. So Metra um, did an RF. I don't want to say what because I don't remember if it was an RFI or RFP about getting new gallery cars, and the vendor said, "Guys, we don't make that anymore." And so they had to do something different. I don't know what they're doing. The loading gauges, not just in the West Coast, in the entire United States, except for the Northeast corridor, and even on the Northeast corridor, the loading gauges are by European standards large. I think Northeast corridor is probably about Nordic, and then the rest of America is higher. And yeah, you can superliner, but at some point the question is why. I mean, you just at some point you're just making the train heavier for no gain. So yeah, I mean you can run superliners, but run the stuff that everyone else builds, please. Be standardized. Don't be bespoke is one of the design lessons that we have. So in the report we talk about the importance of having design that can be pretty but needs to be minimalistic. You don't need to have a station with too many different spaces for different users. You don't need to build stations that are twice as big as they need to be because of crossovers or back office space. Um, but also, you need the stations to be standardized: one escalator vendor, one elevator vendor, not two as for Second Avenue Subway, two escalator vendors. Um, the locations of the escalators should be consistent. Elevators, all of this should be very standardized. Um, yeah, okay. In terms of their marketing, yeah, and I know the Canadian, there's either American or Canadian um, something called bi-level and multi-level. It's just that again, from the perspective of where the market is, which is in Europe, there isn't. And I say Europe and not China or Japan because first of all, the American market essentially is regulatorily European. The vendors are almost always European, rarely Japanese or Chinese, and the Chinese or Japanese ones um, make things for the American market that are special to America or maybe at this point derived from Europe. And second, Japan barely has bi-levels. I don't know if China has any bi-levels. The high-speed trains in China, which are by far the dominant form of rail travel there on the main line are all single level. Yeah, by this stuff Caltrain got from Stadler, but please be competent about managing for uh be competent with managing the contractors because Stadler has horror stories. This is going to be the last question because I need to go. Why are intercity stations increasingly built with no spaces for passengers to sit? Because the people who are designing these stations hate homeless people more than they like the customers. Like, this is what the situation is with Moynihan Green Hall. It's literally hostile. It's literally hostile architecture. They think that if there are places to sit, it will attract homeless people. It is worse to have homeless people than to have a station that is not accessible whatsoever to any passenger who needs to sit for any reason or might just want to sit. Um, this is, to be very clear, a terrible trend. I'm going to stop here. As I said, it's going to be a short stream. I do need to go. Thank you all for watching. I will upload this tonight. This, to be very clear, is New York time, not Berlin time. And I will see you in a week. I will be. I hope in a week to be able to stream again. If not, then in 2 weeks, certainly. Often when you're asking a person, they do say, "Well, we've had problems with homelessness," and they just say safety. Sometimes is the code for this, or feeling, or passengers are worried about crime, or what they mean is they heard they saw a person be homeless, or they heard a black person speak very vernacular black English without code switching for white people. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you again, I hope in a week, if not in 2. So, ciao ciao.